Spring in Connecticut was always deceptively beautiful. Blossoming trees, sunlight on crisp white fences, the scent of lilacs drifting through the windows. But behind the manicured lawns and symmetrical hedges of my childhood home was a life where perfection wasn't just expected, it was demanded. My name is Amanda Harrington, youngest of 3. The only one who didn't make my father proud. My earliest memories aren't of birthday cakes or bedtime stories. They're of checklists, chores, expectations wrapped in stern glances and silence. My father, Richard Harrington, wasn't just a banking executive. He was a force. Charismatic in public, ruthless at home. In his eyes, children were projects. Projects either succeeded or they failed. My brother Daniel was the blueprint. Philippe, CFO by 30. A man who shook hands with senators. My sister Rebecca was the prodigy. Dual degrees from Harvard. Married to a top surgeon. They were the Harringtons worth showing off. And then there was me. I like stories, not spreadsheets. I sketched in the margins of my textbooks, wrote poems I never showed anyone. I once got a B+ in calculus and cried in the school bathroom because I knew what that would mean at dinner. Sure enough, that night my father didn't speak to me. Just passed the green beans to Daniel and asked about his Model UN debate. That's how love worked in our house. It wasn't unconditional. It was transactional. My mother, Joanna, tried to shield me in quiet ways. A smile when I slipped a short story under her pillow. A soft squeeze of my shoulder when I faltered under my father's stare. She never confronted him, she couldn't. But she made the silence less cold. Until she got sick. I was 20 when she died of ovarian cancer. Her last days were filled with the beeping of machines and the smell of antiseptic, not the comfort of a home. My father didn't cry at the funeral. He shook hands, thanked people for coming. And the next morning he was back in his office making decisions. I never forgave him for that. College was my chance to escape. I didn't apply to business schools like he wanted. I chose NYU and majored in English literature. You're throwing your life away, he told me. On fantasies. Maybe. But it was the first decision I made for myself. He cut me off that day. Said I needed to learn how the real world works. And so I did. A waitress. I applied for every scholarship I could find. I lived on ramen and late-night study sessions. And slowly, painfully, I built a life. I graduated magna cum laude. Got a job as an editorial assistant at a mid-size publisher in Manhattan. It didn't pay much, but it fed my soul. I didn't hear from my father for 5 years. Not a call. Not a card. Not even on my birthday. He still sent Daniel and Rebecca Rolexes and Christmas bonuses. Got silence. I used to stare at my phone some nights, debating whether to text him. But I never did. I told myself I didn't need his approval. That I didn't care. But I did. God, I did. That's the thing about people who raise you with conditions. Even when you leave, those conditions follow you. I carried the belief that I wasn't enough like a shadow on my back. Crept into my work. My relationships. My reflection in the mirror. 4 years, I dated men who mirrored my father. Emotionally distant, high-achieving and cold. Men who praised my ambition but never truly saw me. Until I met Scott. But that's a story for part 2. Before we go there, let me know in the comments. Have you ever felt like the outsider in your own family? Because if so, you're not alone. And what happened next at my father's retirement dinner? The humiliation, the betrayal, and the moment my husband stood up, changed the entire trajectory of my life. Stick around. You'll want to hear this. It's strange how the right person can enter your life so quietly, so gently, that you don't even realize the foundation is shifting beneath your feet until everything feels sturdier, safer. For me, that person was Scott Taylor. I met him on a rainy Tuesday afternoon at a second-hand bookstore tucked away on 9th and Thompson in Manhattan. I was 28, running late for a meeting, and drenched from head to toe. The bookstore was warm, dry, and smelled like dust and old pages, a haven. I was reaching for a worn copy of Middlemarch when another hand reached for it at the same time. I looked up, ready to apologize, and found myself looking into a pair of kind eyes. Not flashy, not trying to impress. You go ahead, he said with a soft smile. I've read it 3 times. You look like you need it more than I do. I laughed. A real laugh, the kind that felt like it came from somewhere I'd forgotten existed. And just like that, we started talking. We never went to our respective appointments. We spent the next 3 hours in the cramped bookstore cafe, sipping over steep tea and trading book recommendations. I found out he was a software engineer who worked remotely, which meant he often spent his breaks reading. He loved Austen, had a soft spot for Nabokov, and could quote entire passages from Baldwin. But it wasn't just what he read. It was how he listened. I'd spent so many years in conversations where I was either being evaluated or dismissed, where silence meant judgment was being passed. With Scott, the silences were comfortable. He didn't interrupt. He didn't shift the conversation back to himself. When I told him about my dream of starting a small publishing house focused on underrepresented voices, he didn't laugh or ask how I'd make money. He asked me what kinds of authors I wanted to champion. That night, I walked home with a wet paperback in my bag and a feeling in my chest I hadn't felt in years. Hope. We started dating slowly, carefully. I was cautious, used to bracing myself for disappointment. But Scott never gave me a reason to flinch. He was the kind of man who noticed when I was quiet for too long and waited gently until I spoke. He brought me coffee just the way I liked it, with oat milk and exactly 1.5 sugars. When I got too anxious to go to crowded parties, he stayed in and watched movies with me. He didn't try to fix me. He just stayed. A year later, I was laid off from the publishing company. Budget cuts, downsizing. I was devastated not just because I loved the work but because I felt like I'd failed again. Like maybe my father had been right all along. Maybe I wasn't built for this world. But Scott didn't see it that way. That night, he made us grilled cheese and tomato soup, my childhood comfort food, and asked, "What if this is the opportunity you've been waiting for?" I stared at him. To do what? Be unemployed with better lighting? No, he said. To start Lighthouse. That's what I'd always called it in my journal. Lighthouse Press. A dream I'd shelved long ago, thinking it was too unrealistic, too fragile. But Scott didn't think it was fragile at all. He sat with me at our kitchen table for weeks, helping me map out a business plan, budgeting, guiding me through the parts one didn't understand. He invested his own savings not because I asked but because he believed in me. We started small. My living room became our office. I reached out to every underpublished author I'd ever admired. We published our first title within 6 months. A coming-of-age novel by a queer Nigerian-American writer that had been rejected by 8 major houses. It didn't become a bestseller, but it made enough noise in the indie community to get noticed. We sold out our first print run in under 3 weeks. By year 2, we had 5 titles on our catalog. One of them was shortlisted for a regional literary award. Another was picked up by a university curriculum. We weren't making millions, but we were making a difference. Scott and I got married that fall in the Boston Public Library. Just 30 people. No ball gowns, no chandeliers. Just books, fairy lights, and our closest friends. My father didn't come. He said he had a leadership retreat in Aspen. I didn't believe him. Daniel sent a gift card and a note that said, "Congrats, don't quit your daydream." Rebecca showed up but left before the reception. "I have a surgery tomorrow," she said. I remember standing by the window after the ceremony, watching her taxi disappear into the night, and wondering how I had come from the same family. Scott wrapped his arms around me. "They don't define you," he whispered. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But it's hard to undo decades of programming. Even on our happiest days, when we hit a sales milestone, or when we signed our first debut poet, I'd catch myself wondering if my father would have cared. If he'd call me just once and say, "I'm proud of you." That call never came. For years I told myself I was over it, that I'd created my own family now, and that was enough. But the child inside me still held on to that impossible wish, to be seen not as a failure or a disappointment, but as someone worthy. Then the invitation arrived. It came in a thick white envelope, sealed with a gold wax stamp bearing the Harrington family crest, because of course it did. Inside was a formal invitation to my father's retirement dinner. 40 years as Executive Vice President of First Atlantic Bank. The event was to be held at the Arbor House, a 5-star estate venue overlooking the water in Cape Cod. Black tie, champagne reception, plated dinner, beaches. I stared at the RSVP card for over an hour. Scott found me at the kitchen table, frozen in place. "You okay?" Passed him the card. "Wow," he said after reading it. "He's really going out with a bang." I laughed, but it was hollow. Why invite me now? He hasn't spoken to me in 3 years. Maybe he's trying to make amends. Or maybe he just wants me to be another prop for his retirement legacy. Scott didn't argue. He just waited like he always did, until I reached my own conclusion. I want to go," I said finally. "Not for him. For me. I want to be able to say I showed up. I existed." "I'll be right beside you," he said. And he was. The days leading up to the dinner were tense. Had nightmares. I paced our apartment like a trapped bird. I kept imagining all the things my father might say. Or worse, all the things he wouldn't. I went shopping for a dress and ended up in tears in the dressing room after the 4th rejection from my reflection. Scott sat with me on the floor that night, eating takeout, reassuring me for the 100th time. Whatever happens there, whatever he says or doesn't say, it doesn't take away from everything you've built. You're not going there to ask for his approval. You're going to remind yourself you never needed it. The night of the dinner, I put on a navy blue gown. Elegant, understated, safe. Curled my hair. Put on the necklace my mother had left me in her will. The one my father said wasn't really worth much, but it felt like armor. We drove in silence most of the way. Scott reached for my hand halfway there, and I held on like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. As we pulled into the long gravel driveway of the Arbor House, a valet opened my door, and I stepped out into the crisp coastal air. The estate glittered like something out of a magazine. All lantern-lit windows, ivy-covered stone, and manicured rose gardens. Inside, the air buzzed with clinking glasses and polite laughter. Waitstaff floated through the crowd with flutes of champagne. String music played softly beneath the hum of conversation. The guest list was a who's who of New England banking, law, and medicine. Everyone looked polished, expensive, confident, like they belonged. I wasn't sure I did. Until Scott leaned in and whispered, "You belong more than anyone here." And for the first time in years, I almost believed him. But what happened next would shatter the illusion of family once and for all. Because when my father finally saw me, it wasn't with pride. It was with calculation. And what he said in front of that room full of people, what he did, humiliated me more than I thought possible. But that was before my husband stood up. And when he did, everything changed. The grand foyer of the Arbor House shimmered with the kind of polished elegance my father always associated with success. Tall vases of white orchids flanked the entryway, and a grand staircase swept upwards beneath a crystal chandelier that cast tiny prisms of light across the marble floor. The scent of lemon polish, roses, and expensive cologne clung to the air. The sound of laughter and the faint notes of a string quartet spilled from the banquet hall ahead. A gilded space filled with polished wood, gold-accented mirrors, and people dressed to impress. I paused just inside the threshold, a little overwhelmed. I hadn't stepped into my father's world in years. Not since the last Christmas he invited me, only to spend most of the evening listing Rebecca's medical accolades and Daniel's promotion at Morgan Blackstone, while I sat quietly near the bar, nursing a ginger ale because I'd driven myself in the snow. Scott reached for my hand. I felt his thumb make a slow, steady circle on my palm, our silent grounding signal. I nodded, inhaled through my nose, exhaled out my mouth, just like my therapist had taught me. "You ready?" he asked softly. I wasn't. But I said, yeah. A hostess in black satin led us into the banquet hall, her heels clicking across the floor. There were at least 100 people already there, all swirling around high tables and the champagne fountain that sparkled at the center of the room. Laughter floated through the air like perfume. I recognized a few faces from newspaper clippings and family photos. My father's peers, CEOs, board members, old money types with strong handshakes and thin smiles. And then I saw him. Richard Harrington, my father, stood at the far end of the room, surrounded by men in navy suits and women in sleek gowns. He wore a tailored tuxedo, his white hair combed back neatly, his bearing as stately and unbothered as ever. He looked like he belonged on the cover of a finance magazine, which I suppose he had been at one point. He laughed at something one of the men said, tilting his head back just slightly, the way he always did when he wanted to appear magnanimous. His laugh hadn't changed. It had always been calculated, practiced. He hadn't seen us yet. And for a moment I considered just turning around and walking out. But then I remembered the years I'd spent working 3 jobs just to pay my rent while he ignored my existence. I remembered all the nights I wondered if I had been born wrong, the defective child who couldn't make him proud. I wasn't going to walk out this time. Not yet. Scott and I were guided to the edge of the room where waiters offered champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres on silver trays. I declined the drink. My stomach was a knot. Before I could even orient myself, Daniel appeared. "Amanda," he said, blinking as if I were an apparition. "Hi, Daniel," I said. He looked good as usual. Polished, confident. His hair flecked with the kind of gray that looked expensive. He wore the family jeans like a tailored suit. His expression flickered with a polite smile, but his eyes betrayed the same faint disapproval I remembered from childhood, the way he used to look at me when I brought home drawings instead of trophies. "You actually came," he said. "I was invited," I said simply. Daniel nodded as if to say fair point. Then he turned to Scott. "Good to see you again." Scott offered his usual kind, firm handshake. "You too, Daniel." Daniel didn't ask how we'd been. Instead, he gestured with his glass toward the far end of the room. "Dad's in the thick of it. This is basically a coronation." "Of course it is," I murmured. Scott gave my hand a small squeeze. I scanned the room and spotted Rebecca across the hall in a floor-length emerald green gown. Her hair was pulled into a severe chignon, and she was talking animatedly with a cluster of surgeons and their spouses. She caught my eye, paused, and gave me a brief nod. Not a smile. Just an acknowledgement. Like a senior partner noting the presence of an intern. She didn't walk over. Neither did I. Instead, Scott and I drifted toward the periphery, collecting more glances than greetings. People recognized me vaguely, but with that puzzled expression, the kind reserved for relatives you don't expect to see. Wasn't she the artistic one? I think she moved to New York. She runs a blog. Or something with books. I heard snatches of conversation as we passed, low voices layered with condescension. Scott, as always, didn't flinch. He just leaned closer and whispered, "If I ever act like any of these people, you have permission to divorce me immediately." That made me laugh just a little. Dinner was called shortly after. A bell chimed, and the guests began to file into the formal dining room adjacent to the hall. I instinctively tensed, wondering where we'd be seated. When the hostess checked the card, her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Harrington Table, Satellite 3, she said. We were led to a small round table tucked in the far corner of the room, nowhere near the long central table where my father, Daniel, Rebecca, and all their VIP guests were seated. Our table mates were distant relatives and old co-workers. The kind of people you invite for formality, not for meaning. I tried not to show my disappointment, but Scott saw it. He reached under the table and took my hand. "I'd rather be here with you than anywhere else," he said. The salad course was served. Then the entree. Speeches began soon after. One from the CEO of First Atlantic, another from Daniel, who stood and delivered a speech so full of buzzwords and false humility that it could have been copy-pasted from Forbes. And then my father stood. The room quieted immediately. Even the waitstaff stilled. All eyes turned to Richard Harrington, the man of the hour. He began slowly, methodically, the way he always did when he wanted to control a room. He thanked his colleagues, spoke of the company's growth, of mergers, of sacrifices. He smiled when he spoke of his team, called them family. And then he shifted. Family, he repeated, raising his glass. True family to me has never been just about blood. It's about those who share your values, who carry your legacy forward with integrity, with excellence. Those who honor what we've built. My stomach turned. I felt Scott go still beside me. I've been blessed, my father continued. Blessed with children who've exemplified those ideals. Daniel, who's taken our name to the top of the financial world. Rebecca, who saves lives and carries herself with brilliance. My real legacy. There was a pause. A small, deliberate one. And then he turned his head toward me. Locked eyes. And then, he said, voice suddenly sharper, there are others who've chosen their own paths, and I respect that. But tonight isn't about daydreams or disappointments. There was a ripple of polite, confused laughter. My face went hot. He didn't say my name, but he didn't need to. Everyone in that room, everyone, knew who he was talking about. Some people, he added, should know when it's time to leave the table, so the rest of us can celebrate without distraction. Silence. Complete silence. It took me a second to register what had just happened. My brain refused to believe it. It felt like a dream or a nightmare. The kind where you show up to school naked or forget your lines on stage. And then I realized, this was real. He had just publicly, intentionally dismissed me, erased me. In front of CEOs, family, strangers, colleagues. Humiliated me. I rose shakily to my feet. My chair scraped loudly against the floor. My vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall. And then, before I could speak, before I could even breathe, Scott stood up beside me. Said he, furious. He placed a hand on my back, just between my shoulder blades, grounding me. And then he turned to face the room. Actually, he said, voice carrying effortlessly across the stunned silence, I think it's time we said a few words. And what he said next, what he revealed, left that glittering room stunned in silence. Because sometimes, dignity walks out not with bowed shoulders, but with the full weight of truth at its back. And for the first time in my life I realized, I wasn't the one who should feel ashamed. Scott's voice was calm, but every word sliced through the tension in the banquet hall like a scalpel. Before we leave, I think it's time I said a few things, he began, straightening his tie. His hand still gently supporting the center of my back. Every eye turned. Conversations froze. My father, still holding his champagne glass mid-air, narrowed his eyes. He looked surprised but not threatened. Not yet. Because Richard Harrington had spent his life surrounded by people who knew better than to challenge him. Scott wasn't one of them. I'm Scott Taylor, he said clearly. His voice echoing slightly off the vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. Amanda's husband. And I've sat through enough family gatherings with plastered smiles and whispered insults, but tonight crossed a line. A very public line. My knees trembled, but I didn't sit down. I stayed standing beside him. His words weren't just for them. They were for me too. I don't come from money, he continued. I grew up in a row house in Pittsburgh. My parents were school teachers. We didn't have generational wealth or country club memberships. What we did have was love, respect, kindness, things you can't measure in Ivy League degrees or retirement bonuses. There was a shuffle at the head table. Rebecca shifted in her seat, and Daniel stared down into his wine glass like he wished it would swallow him whole. Scott turned toward the long main table, toward my father. Richard, he said, not Mr. Harrington, not sir. Just Richard, level and unwavering. Tonight, you stood in front of 100 people and decided that your legacy would be built on exclusion, on cruelty. You diminished your own daughter to elevate your ego. A hush fell like a curtain. The string quartet had stopped playing. The servers froze mid-step. Somewhere near the back someone whispered, "Is this really happening?" "It is," Scott said, as if in response. "Let me tell you about Amanda. Since you're clearly unfamiliar with the woman she's become." He turned slightly, addressing the room now, "Not just my father. Amanda built a publishing house from scratch. Not with investors or trust funds, but with talent and tenacity. Her authors have gone on to win awards and change lives. She gives a voice to stories this world needs to hear. She mentors writers. She works 80-hour weeks. She is, without question, the most brilliant, resilient, and compassionate person I have ever met." My throat caught. My hands trembled. Not from fear, but from something I hadn't felt in years. Being seen. "And yet," Scott continued, "she spent most of her life trying to earn the approval of a man who wouldn't notice if she set herself on fire." The silence was absolute now. My father's jaw was set tight. His eyes darted toward the other guests, scanning their reactions, measuring them, calculating. Scott pressed on. "I've watched Amanda stay up at night wondering if she was a disappointment. I've watched her shrink herself at family events so others could shine. I've listened to her doubt her worth because her father couldn't say 3 simple words. 'I'm proud of you.'" He paused, his voice softening but not weakening. "Well, I'm proud of her. Every single day. I'm proud of the woman she is, the life she's built, the love she gives so freely. And if anyone in this room thinks less of her because her achievements don't come with a Wall Street bonus or a medical license, then maybe you're not the kind of people whose opinion matters." That was when he turned fully to face my father again. His expression unreadable, but powerful in its restraint. "You had a chance tonight," Scott said quietly. "To rewrite history. To heal wounds. Instead, you opened them in front of your entire kingdom. And for what? Applause. Validation." My father didn't speak. His face was stone. He took a small sip from his glass, the motion deliberate. His only reply. "We're leaving now," Scott said. "Because dignity doesn't sit quietly at the feet of cruelty." And then, he did something I never expected. He held out his hand to me, palm up, like we were on a dance floor and he was inviting me to step into the light. Took it. The moment our hands touched, the room split into 2 halves, those who remained seated and those who turned to watch us walk away. We didn't rush. We didn't slink out in shame. We walked calmly, past the table of my cousins who suddenly couldn't meet my eyes, past the elderly man who'd once patted me on the head and said, "You'll bloom eventually," past the woman who'd whispered, "That's the writer, right?" Just an hour earlier. Scott held his head high. And beside him, for once in my life, so did I. Just as we reached the doors, someone stood. It was Aunt Lillian, my father's youngest sister. The black sheep of the Harringtons. The one who'd eloped with a jazz musician and was rarely invited to anything but funerals. She clapped. Once. 3 times. Then someone else joined her. A junior colleague of Daniel's. One of the people seated at the irrelevant table. Then a third. Then a fourth. It wasn't thunderous. But it didn't have to be. It was enough. Enough to carry us out the doors without apology. The hallway outside the ballroom was empty. Silent. We didn't speak right away. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my purse. But Scott turned to me, his face soft with concern. "Hey," he whispered. "Are you okay?" I nodded, and for the first time all night I wasn't lying. "I've waited my whole life for someone to stand up for me like that," I said quietly. "You shouldn't have had to wait," he replied. We left the Arbor House and stepped into the cool Cape Cod night. The valet brought our car. Scott tipped him and opened my door. As I slid inside, I looked back at the grand estate behind us. Glowing, gilded, impressive, and hollow. Inside was a man who had spent his life constructing an empire of control and appearances. But outside, in a beat-up sedan filled with love and literature, I had something far greater: peace. That night, as we drove back to the little Airbnb we'd rented on the coast, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't spiral. I just breathed. It felt like shedding a skin I'd worn for too long. A skin made of inadequacy, comparison, and silent shame. And as I sat there, watching the headlights blur past the trees, I realized something vital. I had spent years believing that walking away from family meant giving up. But maybe, just maybe, it meant choosing something better. Not perfection. Not validation. But freedom. What happened next? Well, let's just say the aftershocks of that night didn't end when we left the banquet. Because my father may have tried to bury me in silence. But by the time the week was over, the entire legacy he'd built would start to crumble. And I wouldn't have to lift a finger. The next morning, I woke to the sound of gulls shrieking somewhere beyond the window and the distant crash of Cape Cod's early tide. The light filtering through the curtains was soft and gray, the kind of light that blurs sharp edges. I lay still for a moment, breathing in the silence, half expecting my chest to feel heavy, as if the weight of everything that happened the night before would suddenly come crashing back. But instead I felt light, untethered. Like I had finally exhaled after holding my breath for 32 years. Scott was already up, barefoot and shirtless in the kitchen of the Airbnb, pouring coffee into mismatched ceramic mugs. I watched him for a moment, the easy way he moved, like nothing about last night had left a dent in him. But then he turned and saw me watching, and I caught it, just a flicker of worry in his eyes. "You slept?" he asked gently, setting a mug down beside me. "I think I actually did," I replied, sitting up and wrapping the blanket around my shoulders. "I expected to feel wrecked. But I don't." He sat beside me, resting one arm behind me on the couch. "You shouldn't. What happened last night? That wasn't about you. That was a man clinging to power in a room full of illusions." I sipped my coffee and let the warmth settle into my hands. "It's weird," I said after a while. "How someone can control the way you see yourself for so long. And then, in one moment, it all just cracks." Scott didn't say anything. He just brushed his thumb over my knuckles and let the silence hold us. But the fallout had only just begun. I didn't plan to check my phone that day. I told myself I would take the weekend. Just 48 hours to exist outside the noise. But sometime around noon, curiosity won. I turned it on, and within moments, the notifications lit up like a pinball machine. I wasn't tagged in anything directly, but I didn't need to be. A video from the retirement banquet had already made it to LinkedIn, then Reddit, then somehow to TikTok. It wasn't even shot on purpose. It was a 30-second clip someone had filmed during the toast, someone probably recording my father's speech for posterity, just in time to catch Scott's calm, devastating rebuttal. The title read, "Man Defends Wife After Her Father Publicly Shames Her at His Own Retirement Party." It had over 3.8 million views. I watched it with a mix of awe and nausea. The camera was shaky, the lighting terrible, but the audio was clear enough. You could hear the edge in my father's voice as he said, "Some people should know when it's time to leave the table." You could hear the room fall silent. You could hear Scott, voice steady, say, "You had a chance tonight to heal. And you chose ego." The comments were a landslide of support. Strangers from around the world were calling Scott a hero. People were dissecting every moment of the exchange like it was a courtroom drama. Therapists were quoting it. Daughters were crying in the replies. I looked up at Scott. "You went viral." He grimaced. "I didn't mean to." "I know," I said. "But I'm glad you did." That afternoon the calls started. Not to me. No one from my family had that kind of courage. But to Scott. His old co-workers. College friends. Even his mother, who left a long, weepy voicemail saying she'd never been prouder. Then late that evening Scott's phone buzzed again. Unknown number. He answered cautiously. "This is Scott." There was a pause. Then, "Mr. Taylor, this is Doug Weiss. I'm a senior partner at Ainsley & Clark, First Atlantic Bank's outside legal counsel. I was hoping we could speak for a moment. Off the record." Scott put the phone on speaker. I assume this has something to do with last night, he said. Yes, Doug said, sounding weary. More specifically, with the video that's now circulating. Mr. Harrington's comments were not in line with the board's values. Public relations is concerned. We've already had clients reach out. And shareholders. Scott frowned. I don't work for First Atlantic. No, but your wife is the one being publicly humiliated by their EVP. And we both know perception drives response. The board is requesting a statement of apology from Mr. Harrington, ideally issued before Monday. I felt like I was watching an empire begin to tilt. Later that night, Daniel texted. Not a call, just a message. Hey, that got out of hand. I didn't know he was going to say that. Are you okay? I stared at it for a long time. Not an apology. Not an ounce of accountability. Just distance. Discomfort. I didn't reply. Rebecca didn't reach out at all. Which honestly was somehow more honest. But it was the email that came the next morning that caught me off guard the most. It was from the Boston Journal. One of their columnists wanted to interview me. About Lighthouse Press. About the publishing world. And, though they didn't say it outright, about the woman whose name was suddenly attached to the most watched family drama video of the week. I hesitated. Scott watched me reading the email. You don't have to respond, he said. I know, I replied. But maybe I should. So I did. Not to give them gossip, but to tell the real story. About the authors we publish. About why I started Lighthouse. About why literature matters more than legacy. The article ran 3 days later. Headline: The Daughter the Room Tried to Forget, and Why She Matters More Than Ever. My inbox flooded with messages from readers, writers, old classmates, even professors from Amherst. An indie bookstore in Vermont offered to do a Lighthouse Author Weekend. A university asked if I would keynote a symposium on inclusive publishing. The irony wasn't lost on me. My father had tried to humiliate me into silence. Instead, he gave me a microphone. Meanwhile, the fallout for him was swift. On Friday, First Atlantic announced that Richard Harrington's retirement would be effective immediately. No final appearances. No golden handshake. No framed oil painting in the executive hallway. They replaced the announcement on the company homepage with a carefully worded message. We thank Mr. Harrington for his decades of service, and we reaffirm our commitment to equity, inclusion, and respect, inside and outside our boardrooms. That same day I received a letter. Mailed. Handwritten. On heavy cream stationery bearing the Harrington crest. My father's handwriting. Elegant. Precise. Amanda, you've made your point. I hope you find peace in whatever this was. R.H. No apology. No acknowledgement of pain. Just bruised ego masquerading as indifference. I folded the letter once and placed it in a drawer. I didn't need it. Not anymore. Because for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a mistake. Or a disappointment. Or someone who had to prove herself just to be invited to the table. I had built my own table. With my own stories. And my own family. That night, Scott and I sat on the balcony of our tiny Airbnb, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the tide crash below. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. The stars above Cape Cod sparkled faintly. The wind carried the scent of salt and sea grass. And in the quiet, I thought about my mother. How she used to sneak into my room after my father's rants and whisper, "You are not the sum of what he sees." I finally understood what she meant. 6 months later, I returned to Boston. Not to beg for acknowledgement or reopen wounds that had finally begun to scar over, but for something much more personal. Something deeply mine. Lighthouse Press was being honored with the New England Emerging Literary Visionary Award, given to small publishers who champion marginalized voices in meaningful, measurable ways. It wasn't a headline award. It wouldn't trend on LinkedIn. But it mattered. To the authors we supported. To the readers we reached. And quietly, to me. The ceremony was being held at the old Cambridge Historical Society building, just a few blocks from the bookstore where Scott and I first met. over a rare edition of Jane Eyre and a shared love for the kind of stories that save people from themselves. The room was warm, filled with soft lighting, indie booksellers, young writers, and professors. There were no tuxedos or gold cufflinks. No champagne fountains or string quartets. Just paperbacks, heartfelt applause, and people who loved language more than legacy. I wore a deep plum wrap dress, the one Scott always said made me look like poetry, and pinned my mother's old silver locket to the inside neckline, right above my heart. She never got to see any of this. Never got to meet Scott. Never got to read the books I published. But she was with me. In the silence before my name was called, I felt her most of all. "Please welcome Amanda Harrington Taylor," the host said, smiling as she gestured me toward the podium. There was a moment of quiet clapping. And then I stood. My heels clicked against the worn wooden floor as I walked forward. Not nervously, not apologetically, but as a woman who had finally come into the full length of her own shadow. As I stepped up to the mic, I scanned the audience and locked eyes with Scott near the back. His smile anchored me as it always did. "Hi," I said. I wasn't raised to believe this kind of night was possible. In fact, I was raised to believe that literature was a waste of potential, that words couldn't feed you, couldn't elevate your status, couldn't turn a name into a legacy. There was a low murmur of recognition from the audience. We all knew that voice, the one that questions our dreams the moment they step out of a bankable path. But here's the thing, I continued. Stories are legacy. They hold what power can't. They survive when egos don't. They are how we heal, how we connect, how we build something that outlives our titles and bank accounts. Lighthouse Press was born out of rejection, but it grew through love. The love of stories, of voices often overlooked, of writers told they were too niche or quiet to matter. I paused, feeling the words settle. I didn't build Lighthouse to prove anything to anyone, but along the way, I proved everything to myself. When I stepped down from the podium, the applause wasn't thunderous, but it was real. And sometimes, quiet claps from the right people mean more than standing ovations from the wrong ones. Afterward, Scott wrapped me in a hug, pressing a kiss to the side of my head. "You were brilliant," he whispered. "I didn't cry," I said, my voice trembling anyway. "That's okay," he smiled. "I did." Later that night, we walked past the old bookstore where we first met. It had changed names, been renovated, but I still remembered the exact shelf. Fiction, Bronte to Cheever. It was like visiting a sacred place. The kind where your life quietly pivots without you even realizing it at the time. We stood on the sidewalk, watching through the window as a teenage girl flipped through a dog-eared copy of The Bell Jar. And I smiled because I knew what she was looking for. Herself. That was always the point. That week I received a letter. Not an email. Not a text. A handwritten envelope addressed to me. My full married name. Amanda Harrington Taylor. The return address was unfamiliar. Upstate New York. Inside was a short note. Just a paragraph. "Dear Amanda, I saw your speech online. Friend forwarded it to me. I don't know if you remember me. I was your third-grade teacher, Ms. Kelly. I just wanted you to know that I'm proud of you. I always knew you had something special in you. Your words made me cry today, and I wanted to say thank you for following them." It broke me open in the gentlest way. Not because of what she said, but because of how long I'd waited to hear it, from someone who saw me not as a disappointment, but as a light. And that was when I realized I didn't need my father's praise anymore, because I had become my own confirmation. He didn't know the full story of me, but I did. Few weeks later, Rebecca called. The conversation was short, polite, careful. She wanted to know if I'd consider attending a small family brunch their firm was hosting. She said she thought things had gone too far. I told her I appreciated the invitation, but I was done showing up to rooms that required me to shrink. Daniel emailed. Said he was considering stepping away from corporate life to pursue nonprofit work. I didn't answer. People change, sure. But sometimes silence is the most honest form of boundary. My father never reached out again. I heard through a cousin that he was keeping a low profile, spending more time at his Vermont cabin, no longer giving lectures on family legacy at networking events. In the end, he had built a life on status. But status is only impressive until it evaporates. I built mine on words. And words last. Now, on quiet Sunday mornings, Scott and I sit in the breakfast nook of our Boston brownstone, sipping coffee and reading manuscripts from writers who still believe in the power of story. Some are young. Some are immigrants. Some are older women writing their first novel at 62. All of them matter. All of them are building legacies in sentences, not spreadsheets. And as for me, I wake up proud. Not because I'm the CEO of a growing press. Not because of the award. Not even because of the viral video. I'm proud because I stood up, walked away, rebuilt myself. I'm proud because I stopped waiting for permission to feel worthy. And I hope, if you're still listening, that wherever you are, whatever room you're sitting in, you know this. You don't need someone else to tell you you're enough. You already are. If you've made it this far, thank you. Truly. This story was written for anyone who's ever been made to feel small in a room they had every right to be in. If Amanda's journey resonated with you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and hit that subscribe button for more emotional stories that feel like a deep breath in a noisy world. We post every week. Real voices, real healing, real drama. Thank you for watching. And remember, legacy isn't what they leave you. It's what you choose to build. See you in the next story.